Hi everyone! The topic of this video has been on the back burner for quite a while. I just needed a jumping off point, something to help me organize my thoughts. I've been listening to Ellen Fisher's podcast, and her recent episode with her sister Hannah was the spark that I needed. If you're unfamiliar, Ellen posts aspirational lifestyle content centered around veganism, sustainability, a whole foods plant-based diet, gardening, gentle parenting, etc. Her sister's content is very similar, but she talks about yoga and writing as well. I found their content to be very inspiring because, aside from the fact that I have no interest in having children, we share a lot of similar interests and values. A few years ago, it became evident that Ellen and Hannah were right-leaning. Although I disagree with a lot of their views, I still think they have good intentions, and I like to hear what they have to say. I've made an effort to understand where they're coming from, and I think their perspective largely comes down to the emphasis they place on personal responsibility. And paradoxically, this is precisely why I was drawn to their content, and precisely why I disagree with them so much. So let's start with the areas of agreement. We all have some level of responsibility for our health, for our happiness, and for our finances. We have some degree of choice in what we eat, what we do, and what we spend our money on. We can all develop healthier habits no matter what our situation is. The power of the mind is strong, and having a growth-based mindset is essential to finding fulfillment in life. Putting in effort to improve your life will yield better results than not putting in effort. I have taken a lot of the advice that Ellen and Hannah give, not necessarily from them directly, but I'll at least give them partial credit for providing inspiration. For example, Ellen has talked about living below your means, working hard, and saving money. Good advice. Eating lots of whole plant foods. Good advice. Prioritizing sleep and limiting screen time. Good advice. Not taking things personally, also good advice. Ellen has mentioned she's a planner, same. I have long-term goals that I'm working towards, including growing my own food. Hannah's video, What Happened When I Started Doing Yoga Every Day, is fantastic. Highly recommend. All of this stuff involves taking personal responsibility. Personal responsibility is a good thing. Where they start to lose me is the political conclusions they reach. For example, Ellen's conclusions about the role of government regarding things like COVID and systemic racism. It's true that if we all just ate healthy, exercised, and prioritized rest, COVID would be way less fatal. But it's also true that vaccines are highly effective, and we can encourage both. The COVID example is complex because Ellen thinks vaccines are dangerous. But I think the fact that most COVID deaths involve comorbidities leads her to believe that COVID is more of an issue of personal responsibility than collective responsibility. Therefore, it's on the individual to take responsibility for their own health, rather than on the government to enforce COVID restrictions and vaccine mandates. In her discussion with Africa Brooke about wokeness, Ellen says a lot of agreeable things about how toxic social media and identity politics can be, but she also expresses views that are rooted in racism. She refers to a post that got her canceled, which was a video she shared by a Black friend of hers. The gist is that she has never felt oppressed as a Black woman in America, and by harping on about systemic racism, we are causing Black people to develop a victim mentality, and that is what is really harming the Black community. I think there's a grain of truth to this. Negativity bias in the media does cause harm. But I don't think the solution is to stop making police brutality a race issue, because it is a race issue. But that, along with the efficacy of vaccines, is beyond the scope of this video. The point is, claiming that what's holding people back is their victim mentality is working backwards from your conclusion. Where does this victim mentality stem from? This conservative talking point takes many forms. It's Black people's dependence on welfare and culture of violence and fatherless homes that are holding them back. But you have to look at why Black people rely on welfare and commit crimes, and why fathers are absent. The reason is systemic racism. Disparities between groups are either environmental or genetic. A culture of violence without the environmental influence of oppression signifies that Black people have a genetic predisposition to violence. And considering that race is a social construct that has no basis in biology, this view is racist. Obviously, it's not healthy to succumb to a victim mentality, because then you perceive yourself to be a victim in scenarios where you're not, and fail to take actions to improve your life. I think the best way to combat this problem of learned helplessness is to sprinkle in some positivity and hope and agency when we talk about these heavy subjects. The left, for the most part, is not advocating for people to just lie down and give up in the face of oppression. but I think we could do a better job at communicating the message in a way that empowers people.
I've gotten that too about like being a woman, like people saying, well, don't you want people to acknowledge that like you're suffering or that you haven't been able to get as far ahead because you're a woman? And my honest opinion is that I've never felt oppressed as a woman. I've never felt like I was less than or couldn't get as far ahead as a woman. If anything, it's the opposite. If anything, our today's culture, I feel like it's easier as a woman. But that's just my personal experience, obviously. Not everybody's going to have that experience, but yeah.
And just like you, I never grew up thinking my girlhood or my womanhood is a burden. Am I aware of the things that happen to women all over the world? Absolutely. And in fact, I would feel as if I'm slapping the women that are truly oppressed in the face for me to sit here in the Western world and say that I'm oppressed. I really would, because I'm aware of what true oppression looks like. Something that I really advocate for is survivors that have experienced FGM, which is female genital mutilation, which is a practice that happens quite a lot in Africa, also Asia, also here in the UK as well a little bit. But I know what oppression actually looks like. And because from what I see is that there seems to be this sort of, you're put on a pedestal the more victimized that you are. And there's a culture of just keeping people terrified. And I think it's keeping women so scared when they're constantly told that you being a woman, you're always going to have it less, that you should always, you know, look out and see where there's a gender pay gap or where there's a gap somewhere that you're not fitting into, or a way that you're disadvantaged, etc. And it's just creating another layer of that culture of keeping people so terrified and just in constant victimhood. And I say that not to say that women are not experiencing really things that we couldn't possibly imagine, but we also need to be willing to hear the women that say, actually, I'm a woman and I don't feel oppressed. There is that side to our experience as well. But for whatever reason, it seems as if you can't even say that, because it means something. It's like you're denying, or it's misogynistic in some strange way. It's so bizarre.
You hit the nail on the head so amazingly there, because it is true. There are women that are truly suffering and are truly being oppressed across the world, and it does feel like a disservice to just say that I'm oppressed. And also, I think whatever you see, whatever you think you see, that will be your reality. What you say to yourself, especially in the Western world where we do have equal rights and we do have the privileges that we do today, that if you are constantly being told you're oppressed, you're oppressed, you're oppressed, whether it be because you're a woman or because of the color of your skin or because of your gender identity, the more that you say it, the more that you will see it, even in places that it doesn't exist. And that's not saying that you won't have certain experiences that could define that, but if you let it define you, that's where it shifts how you put out your life into the world and how you feel inside. So that's not to say that I've never experienced, like I have experienced like certain things because I'm a woman, or the way that I look, right? Like in the workplace, back when I was a waitress, like things like that. But how that defines me is where you move forward. Like if that defines me or not, you know?
Some people get lucky and don't have to deal with a lot of racism or sexism in their lives, but that doesn't mean that they're not oppressed. Fortunately, I've never been raped, but that doesn't mean that I haven't been affected to some degree by rape culture. I understand that making your oppression or trauma your identity is unhealthy, but you can acknowledge the fact that you're oppressed without making it your identity. I used to agree with Ellen about feminism. I can relate to her in that I've never really felt held back as a woman. I thought it was insulting to women in the Middle East for me to claim that I'm oppressed by the patriarchy. What changed my mind was actually a sentiment that Ellen expresses in an episode with her friend Heather.
So specifically then about trauma, what is trauma? Because like you're saying, it's not just those who have experienced sexual abuse or extremely hard childhoods or circumstances, but it can also be someone who was raised in, you know, a regular childhood with sweet loving parents. And so what is trauma exactly then?
So trauma, well, do you want to share? Or?
Go for it.
Trauma is trauma. For one person, trauma can be rape. That's a trauma. For another person, it can be third grade, a teacher giving you a dirty look or something like that.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not judging which one's worse. They're both bad for the person at the time, and they're both not good in general, right? Like but trauma is trauma. And so it's not that, well, this doesn't really matter, let's deal with this. No, let's deal with both. Let's deal with everything.
Right. I don't think you're necessarily trying to be like, oh, a teacher giving you a bad look is just as bad as someone being raped. You're not saying that, just to be clear. I think I know you well enough. I know you well enough to know that's not what you're saying. I think it's more so that, like, let's deal with both.
Yeah.
Right.
Obviously, there's a scale of severity, but just as trauma is trauma, oppression is oppression. Conservatives say they're all about facts over feelings, but they disregard statistics about systemic racism and point to personal anecdotes from Black people who don't feel oppressed. What they fail to acknowledge is that it's possible to live in denial of your own oppression. Not every charge of internalized oppression is valid, but that doesn't mean the concept has no validity. Since Ellen shared this video of her friend on Instagram, she's been more open about her views on this topic. She aligns with Black conservatives like Zuby and Candace Owens. I think a big reason their messaging resonates with Ellen is because it's so focused on personal responsibility. Their plea to the Black community is to stop selling drugs, stop having babies out of wedlock, and vote Republican, the party of personal responsibility. These solutions focus primarily on the individual, but you can't solve systemic problems at the individual level alone. Following their prescription, in order to close racial gaps, Black people would have to work extraordinarily hard, harder than white people. That will never happen because Black people are people, and it's tautological that most people are not extraordinary.
Yes, because I understand, like what you're saying, I understand the intentions behind it of uplifting a certain community and stuff.
Yeah.
But you end up painting an entire group of people as a certain way, as needing to be helped, and it's like a soft bigotry of low expectations.
That's it. That's exactly it.
Let's break down this concept. This phrase was coined by George Bush, or probably his speechwriter, but that's beside the point. In his speech to the NAACP, he shifted the focus away from systemic problems such as underfunding of schools and social programs in Black neighborhoods, and onto the teachers. It was the teachers' low expectations of Black students that were holding them back. This was an attempt to subvert the narrative and paint the result of racial inequality as the cause of racial inequality. This is not to say that teachers' bias isn't a problem. It certainly reinforces the problem. But the fundamental problem is being ignored. On average, Black students do not perform as well as white students because of factors related to poverty. A lack of resources, poor nutrition, and parentification negatively impact academic performance. And Black people are disproportionately poor due to systemic racism. It's not racist to have lower expectations for Black Americans as a whole, based on the recognition that they face more barriers. What's racist is expecting Black Americans to meet the same standards as white Americans, despite these barriers. The overt racist views Black people as intellectually inferior and sees racial disparities as natural. The anti-racist recognizes that Black people are products of their environment, just like everyone else, and sees racial disparities as the result of racism. The subtle racist expects excellence from every Black person, and sees racial disparities as the result of pointing out racial disparities, because that instills a victim mentality. Africa makes a really interesting point about personal responsibility in this discussion.
Personal responsibility, I don't know if this is something you would have spoken about when you spoke to Zuby, but personal responsibility is something that seems to be demonized currently. People seem to think it's synonymous with victim blaming almost, which is another term that has become, kind of taken people's fancy. But when I think of collective sabotage, I just see it as a group of individuals that instead of taking personal responsibility and looking at what they can control and looking at how they can shift their own behavior so they can start to get their desired results, where they learn how to sit with their own discomfort, they don't do any of that. They just think, this is what is happening to me right now. It's uncomfortable and I'm experiencing something I don't like. So therefore, something outside of me is the problem. I don't have to look at any of that. The system is the problem. And here's the thing, because I know some people will try to fill in the gaps here, but I acknowledge the systems that we live under. I wrote this in my letter. I'm able to hold multiple truths. I can acknowledge that there are systems that need to change. And at the same time, as an individual, there are things that are within your control, right?
Yes.
And for you to be able to tune into that, you have to take responsibility for them. You have to take accountability for some of those things. You have to make different decisions.
I appreciate that she acknowledges that systemic change is needed, and that as individuals, there are things that are within our control. These things aren't contradictory. We can hold multiple truths, as she so eloquently put it. Ellen nods in agreement, but her political conclusions and ideas of what systemic change looks like is where our disagreement lies. Africa says personal responsibility is demonized and believed to be synonymous with victim blaming. I want to clarify that it's not personal responsibility in and of itself that I take issue with. Like I said, personal responsibility is a good thing. It's the narrative that conservatives have constructed around personal responsibility that is victim blaming and should be criticized. On a societal level, we can't expect people to just do better. We need to make it easier to do better, because we can't change human nature, but we can change people's material conditions. An example that comes to mind is weight loss. The obesity epidemic is not simply a result of people making bad choices. It's the result of bad policies. Side note, I think we should start calling it the diet-related disease epidemic, because obesity epidemic gives people who are not obese a false sense of security that they won't be impacted by diet-related disease, such as heart disease and certain types of cancer. Highly palatable, high-calorie, disease-causing food is everywhere. It's served in schools and hospitals. It's heavily subsidized and advertised. It's more accessible than healthy whole foods. It's true that it is possible for individuals to change their eating habits and lose weight, but within this system, it takes extraordinary effort on the part of the individual. And like I said earlier, people are people, and most people are not extraordinary. We are evolutionary wired to go for high-calorie foods, and our capitalist system has made us more sedentary and more prone to emotional eating. That's not to say that we shouldn't encourage healthy eating and exercise, but simply promoting individual change without advocating for policy change to knock down the barriers that make it so difficult won't get us very far. Ellen has talked about government subsidies and food deserts before, so I know she's on the same page here. I just think it's important to look at other issues through the same lens. Ellen and Hannah also fail to apply this lens to their discussion about money. Ellen does acknowledge her privilege in this episode, so I'll give her credit for not totally lacking compassion. But keep in mind that neither of them have ever talked about the need for wealth redistribution. Ellen is explicitly pro-capitalism. It's reasonable to infer that they do not support taxing the mega-wealthy and investing in robust social welfare programs. I don't know what their solution to poverty is, besides giving to charity and empowering people to work really hard. These are not policies that address structural barriers.
Okay, but to be clear, that's not to say that like anyone who is struggling with making an income is necessarily just like, oh, you just need to flip your mind. Like there's different situations.
Yeah.
That I feel like there's different situations for so many different types of like places in life that people are at that like, I don't know. Sometimes it takes more than that, and there's a lot. And people
but
are
Ellen,
it starts
there. I'm with you. I know you're trying to be really nice to people right now, but like I'm like, listen, like it starts there.
No, I get you.
Obviously,
No,
that
I get you.
everyone comes from a different background. Everyone has different yes.
Yeah.
But for many, many people, if you can start to feel extreme gratitude for where you are now and what you know is coming, because if you can desire it, it means that you're desiring it for a reason. There's nothing wrong with desiring more for your life. And that was pivotal for me because I felt guilty for wanting more.
Right.
Do you see
yes.
what I mean?
No, I'm so with you right there. I think that our mindset is huge. Personal responsibility is huge and not like blaming others.
Yes.
But I also think it's also really helpful just to preface and laying the groundwork of this type of conversation that like some people are in really, really, really tough situations.
Absolutely.
That it is they're starting at a different place that is harder to get to like a place that maybe someone else is getting to. So just, I don't know, just acknowledging that.
I get that. And I always get the email of like, you don't understand my situation. And sure, I don't understand your situation because I'm not you. But I do know so many people in my life that are don't realize how determined they are to stay in their situation. They are determined to be miserable.
Yeah, and it just goes to show that, like, for whatever hard situation that someone is going through, there's somebody else that has gone through a very similar situation and has pulled themselves through it and
different
become
mindset about it.
Yeah, and have become this incredible, overwhelming success in all facets of life. This is not just about money, but just about success in whatever you feel like is success. I think Dominic Thompson is a perfect example of that. Like, you guys really should go listen to that episode. His story is so incredible. He's very inspiring, all the stuff he overcame. And it really comes down to, like, making a choice to take your chances when you get it and to go for it, and to have that mindset switch is huge. And so part of that too is how we raise our kids.
They both seem to believe in the myth of meritocracy. Maybe not perfect meritocracy, as they acknowledge that you have to work harder if you're less privileged. But they believe that upward mobility is achievable for everyone. In America, if you work hard, make smart decisions, and believe in yourself, you can become financially free. Sure, if you work really hard, perhaps you can pull yourself out of poverty. But again, this requires extraordinary effort on the part of the individual, and most people are not extraordinary.
Our dad grew up in a trailer park and had alcoholic parents, and he just had, his childhood was definitely like a more traumatic type of childhood, where he was determined to not become that as an adult. And he was like, that is not going to be me when I grow up. I'm going to make something of myself. And he was so determined to just be like, he just had so much incredible personal responsibility to get out of his situation. And he did.
And this is what I love about Dad's story, is that he studied philosophy at Humboldt State. Mm-hmm. Such a hippie. Philosophy at Humboldt State.
Yeah.
And then he ended up working as a drafter at an engineering firm. Like, you couldn't get a more opposite sort of career, right? And then he sort of worked his way up to one day he's owning the company, and he is studying for his license. This is the biggest thing. He got his engineering license without having an engineering degree, which is very uncommon. And he studied. You remember during childhood, like, he took that test like 5 times or something, and it was
study so
really hard,
super difficult.
It's an incredibly difficult test. Most people don't pass the first time, and they have engineering degrees. See what I'm saying? Like, he had to really put in the work, and he did it. And I'm just so proud of him.
Oh my gosh, to see, especially when he would tell us about his childhood and what he came from.
Yeah,
we're like, I was always just kind of shocked to hear about it, because he literally changed his life to such a degree that when he raised his own children, we didn't have to go through that.
We wanted nothing.
We didn't. Yeah, it was like he changed his trajectory of his life. He was determined to get out of that situation of growing up in a trailer park, having a hard childhood, and being like, this is not going to be my life when I grow up. And so as he became older, he literally like kind of broke that type of generational thing that can often happen. And as a result, we were so like
fortunate.
have a totally different privileged type of growing up because of his determination and personal responsibility, which I think is an incredible story.
I'm glad they shared this because it explains a lot. Considering parental income is the largest predictor of future income, their dad sounds both extraordinary and lucky. I think Ellen and Hannah are influenced by survivorship bias. They are overly optimistic about others' abilities and outcomes because of the examples in their lives. Unlike the previous example about weight loss, where theoretically everyone could exist at a healthy weight, in a capitalist system, it is structurally impossible for everyone to become financially free. One of the core tenets of financial freedom is to make your money make money for you, which essentially means make money off of other people's labor. Money doesn't just magically multiply, labor makes it multiply. Someone is doing the labor. By investing in real estate, for example, your income is not tied to your labor, it's tied to your tenant's labor. If everyone decided to just make their money make them money, there wouldn't be enough laborers to make the money. You could argue that machines could do the labor, but automation is wreaking havoc on the working class, not liberating them. Anyway, let's say you work really hard and live frugally, so you're able to retire early and live off your own savings and passive income that you created with your own labor. You would be living off the fruits of your own labor rather than off someone else's. Well, that's fucking awesome, but sadly, there are not enough high-paying jobs available for everyone to do this. Try doing this on a grocery store salary. Ellen mentioned that her husband Andrew worked at a grocery store 60 hours a week when they first moved to Hawaii to make ends meet. That is the reality for a lot of people long-term, because it's rare that your wife blows up on social media and you get to quit your job. Financial insecurity is a feature of capitalism. It's not simply a result of bad money management or a negative mindset about money. Sure, financial illiteracy and limiting beliefs can play a role, but that's not what it boils down to. The myth of meritocracy is easily debunked by the data showing growing wealth disparities in supposedly meritocratic economies. According to Wikipedia, some scholars argue that the wealth disparity has even increased because the myth of meritocracy has been so effectively promoted and defended by the elite through media, education, corporate culture, and elsewhere. As described by economist Robert Reich, many Americans still believe in meritocracy despite the nation drifting even farther away from it. The myth of meritocracy has been identified by scholars as a tool of the elite to uphold and justify the reproduction of existing economic, social, and political hierarchies. It is used to maintain the belief that class mobility is widely attainable. Phrases such as pull yourself up by your bootstraps have been identified as concealing the myth of meritocracy by placing the onus of upward class mobility solely on the individual, while intentionally ignoring structural conditions. The minority of individuals who manage to overcome structural conditions and achieve upward class mobility are used as examples to support the idea that meritocracy exists.
It just goes to show that, like, for whatever hard situation that someone is going through, there's somebody else that has gone through a very similar situation and has pulled themselves through
and
it
have a different mindset about it.
Yeah, and have become this incredible, overwhelming success in all facets of life. This is not just about money, but just about success in whatever you feel like it's success. I think Dominic Thompson is a perfect example of that. Like, you guys really should go listen to that episode.
According to an academic study on why Americans overestimate class mobility, research indicates that errors in social perception are driven by both informational factors, such as the lack of awareness of statistical information relevant to actual mobility trends, and motivational factors, the desire to believe that society is meritocratic. And finally, the myth of meritocracy has been identified by scholars as promoting the colorblind philosophy that anyone, regardless of their race or ethnicity, can succeed if they work hard enough. This belief suggests that if a person of color is not succeeding at work, it must be due to laziness or a lack of effort on that person's part, rather than a structural barrier. The myth has been identified as a tool to both invisibilize institutional racism and justify racist attitudes. The belief that the United States is a meritocracy is most accepted as an accurate reflection of reality among young, upper-class whites, and least accepted as an accurate reflection among older, working-class people of color. It's evident that Ellen and Hannah have an extremely high internal locus of control. I talked about this in an old video on toxic positivity and spiritual bypassing. Generally, it is better to have an internal locus of control and believe that you are in control of your own life, rather than an external locus of control and attribute all of your successes and failures to outside influences. People who have a high external locus of control tend to be a lot less driven and are more susceptible to learned helplessness. Obviously, it's better to feel confident when faced with difficult situations than powerless. But there needs to be a balance. If you have an extremely high internal locus of control, you may blame yourself for things that are beyond your control, which can cause anxiety. And if you happen to succeed in life, you may have a difficult time empathizing with people less fortunate than you. After all, if we are in control of our lives and we create our own destiny, then poor people must be poor because on some level, they deserve it. They're just lazy and didn't work as hard as you. This view is referred to as the just world hypothesis. Believing that people get what they attract is a coping mechanism for those who are relatively privileged. It boosts the ego and makes you feel less susceptible to misfortune. Lastly, Ellen's emphasis on personal responsibility is evident in her episode with Heather McKean about the power of the mind. Here's an excerpt from the podcast description. After being diagnosed with a myriad of rare genetic diseases and finding herself drowning in medications with no healing in sight, Heather was introduced to the power of the mind and turned to dealing with her past traumas of abuse. She completely restored her health by changing her subconscious mind and is now passionate in helping people find freedom from trauma, pain, illness, and addiction. The key takeaway from this episode is that our minds are so much more powerful than the medical community thinks. A lot of the claims made are supported only by anecdotal evidence. Call me crazy, but I'm going to trust the medical community over Ellen's friend Heather. Ellen talks about the placebo effect in her intro as if it supports her point about the power of the mind. But the mind is only as powerful as the placebo effect. That's the whole concept of the placebo effect. The mind can influence our physiology to a degree. To a degree. This idea that we can cure diseases with our minds is taking the concept of personal responsibility way too far. Some shit is out of our control. Sometimes medication is necessary. Unlike neurolinguistic programming and energy tapping, drugs have been scientifically proven to have physiological effects that are stronger than the placebo effect. Yes, drugs can have unwanted side effects, especially when combined, and it's fair to argue that they're overprescribed. So it's generally a good idea to strive to be on as few medications as possible. But this anti-drug sentiment really irks me. True holistic healthcare practitioners should not dismiss drugs. Meditation and medication can be complementary. One thing that is clear from all of these examples is that in every good lie, there's truth. I don't think Ellen is intentionally lying, but she is spreading false narratives. She is able to sell these false narratives by wrapping them up in a lot of truths. I'm really not trying to malign Ellen's character. She does consider how her message will be received and is careful to include disclaimers and caveats. But disclaimers are meaningless if the core message is exactly what you're saying you're not saying. You may not have said it explicitly, but you definitely said it implicitly. Like, don't get me wrong, sometimes people read too much into what someone is saying and misconstrue things. But sometimes there is false messaging implicit in what is being said, and no amount of disclaimers will negate it. Another thing to consider is that we can believe or say things without realizing all of the implications they carry. Hannah may not consciously believe that poor people deserve to be poor, and Ellen may not consciously believe that Black people have a genetic predisposition to violence, but these are the implications of what they believe. In conclusion, personal responsibility is great, but there are external forces that impact our lives. Political policy should focus on mitigating these external factors, because we can't change human nature, but we can change people's material conditions. Individual and social responsibility are not mutually exclusive. We should advocate for both. Tautologically, most people are not extraordinary, so we shouldn't expect them to be. And expectations of excellence and the narrative of meritocracy are ableist, in the sense that those who aren't maximally productive and successful are deemed less worthy. Not explicitly, but implicitly, because they have failed to take personal responsibility. Thank you so much for watching. Please give this video a thumbs up and comment down below. And as always, stay tuned for next week. All right, peace out.
Yo, how when me eat them, I wonder when me eat. When me tell them say me no eat no fish, no meat now. How when me eat them, I wonder when me yam. When me tell them say that I'm a vegan man. How when me eat them, I wonder when me eat. When me tell